Welcome to the Healer's Choice. Our first story, hush everyone, is the Bell of Truth. Daylight stretches over Aethiniel, a dukedom broken into many winding districts that differ in class, market, and repair. Its people, nearly as eclectic as its districts, are an amalgamation of races. They range from elves and gnomes to humans and orcs, most working their trade with the enthusiasm of the overtired and humble. However, in the newest of districts, the Pearl Plaza, men and women could be heard buzzing like bumble insects, zipping under the continuously climbing sun. The baker wiped flour-caked fingers on his apron as he smiled greetings to folks that passed by the patissiere window. The clothier, with focused eyes, cut and sewed patterns from gathered bolts of fabric. Food carts and market stalls displaying imported produce and trinkets atop their wooden displays lined the stretches of thoroughfare like steady soldiers. The Pearl's appearance is as fine as its name, its stonework nearly as white as ivory, a pure and high-class place. However, just at the plaza's edge, at the gate, there stands a very plain, very dirty young woman. The guards at either side of the gate watch her with harsh eyes, but allow her to stand near. Her stomach gives a soft churning sound as the scent of bread reaches her nose. Her lips quiver for a moment before she pulls back her hood. The guards relax, recognizing the young woman as she pulls back her dirt-covered cloak. Her matted, mud-colored hair tied high upon her head resembles more a pile of dirt than a braided bun. She nervously faces the guards, giving them a gentle smile. Good day, Julius. Faltho?
Despite her appearance, her smile was healthy, and her voice rang like the bells in winter.
Good day, miss.
Julius, at her right, spoke with sympathy in his eyes.
You're here earlier than normal.
The woman shrank back from his piteous stare.
Yes.
She dug out a small leather coin purse, clutching it close to her chest.
Have you eaten, Eirina? I could take you to have your fill at the bakery.
The young woman didn't answer. Eirina knew that the offer Julius had given in such sweet tones could turn bitter in an instant.
Eirina?
Julius had stepped towards her, his eyes looking down into hers from his head height over her. Eirina practically disappeared into her rags as her head ducked down.
I'm fine. Had some porridge earlier.
She pushed the lie out with little trouble, even managing to keep the shake in her hands from becoming obvious. Both men looked at one another, Faltho rolling his eyes and giving a shrug before pulling his partner back from her.
Ugh. Do not understand why you bother.
Faltho gestured beyond the gate.
If you're here to work, then get to it.
His cold eyes sent chills through the woman. Julius prodded his fellow guardsmen as Eirina quickly escaped further interruptions. She could hear the buzzing of the Pearl, the hive of trade and rich mingling, hollering voices from the stalls and the clap of fine footwear on the sparkling cobble cut into the droning sound of morning murmurs and soft laughter. When the entire plaza was moving with life, Eirina glanced back toward the guards. Neither had their attention on her, at least not openly. She let out a calming breath and let her right foot stride forward, then her left, repeating her stride one after another, to get just within the gate's edge. She looked at her feet. Her woven shoes had been worn with several holes, her toes lined with the gate and several well-worn cobbles that were less alabaster than those within the plaza. She knew she wasn't allowed to go further. She wasn't part of this world of fine silk garments and crystalline jewelry. Her head lifted, looking over the vast shopping district before before her. Servants were moving swiftly, gathering materials, garments, and groceries for their masters. Men and women of courtly demeanor sat at lovely crafted tables and chairs outside of the bakery, sipping teas of various flavors and enjoying the cool early morning light. Tall humanoid folk with silver hair glittering in the early daylight, sorcerers of the various high houses were discussing over scrolls and pointing to stalls that held their interests. Eirina's eyes last passed over the color and various finery, the soft silks and lace of women no older than she, all looking healthy and ready for spring courting. A few of the women passed glances over Eirina, giving chuckles from behind their lace fans. She ignored them. She stood as tall as she could in her woven footwear, then bent forward, placing the leather coin purse flat to the ground, making a small disk of brown on the gleaming cobbles of the plaza. Then, standing straight once again, she took in another breath, opened her mouth, and breezing notes exhaled from her. Those that had been seated outside the bakery, engaging in their conversations, cut themselves off as their attention immediately turned to face the gate. Eirina's voice was like that of a distant siren, small but enticing. It called out to those within earshot. People came forward or shifted where they sat to listen to her song. Some even approached from the main thoroughfare to hear her better. She could recognize several of the faces, being that this was not her first time entertaining this kind of crowd. Young men wore expressions of judgment as they whispered to one another, gesturing over Eirina's appearance, seeming confused. Others gave looks of pity or humor, as though giving Eirina their attention was a benefit to her more than it was to them. However, regardless of their opposing stares, something pulled them in, her voice ensnaring them into curiosity as it has done to so many others. Once her song came to a crescendo and became a shallow whisper, those that had only been listening were brought to their feet, closing in to hear how her song ended. Eirina looked across the faces of those in front of her. Many were in awe, and others were quite confused, mainly the finely dressed women who had sent glares in her direction. She closed the song with a beautifully soft chord that sent the hair to stand on many. She held still for a long moment, waiting for what little donations would come her way. However, to her surprise, the baker left his shop to the attendance of his staff. Eirina's eyes followed him as he approached. The baker, Jacques, a large man with scarred knuckles and gentle green eyes, wiped his hands clean before tossing 2 silver into Eirina's open purse. He wore a wide smile for her, tilting his head slightly before heading back towards his establishment. Her eyes softened as she watched him go. Others that had decidedly stayed to show their begrudging generosity followed shortly after. A few stray coppers landed in the dark spot in front of Eirina. Eirina bowed low to the small group as they began to disperse, eyeing the small number of coins on the ground in front of her. She waited for the people to move back about their business. Collecting her earnings for the morning and cinching her purse tight, she went through the gate in a rush, but was ultimately stopped by Faltho.
Hey, you know our rules.
Eirina clutched her coin purse. Her head hung low as her jaw tightened. Julius pushed Eirina past his partner.
Let her pass, Faltho. She didn't make much.
You're too sweet on this one.
But before she could tuck the pouch away, Eirina found Faltho's shadow standing over her. He snatched her pouch, and she didn't fight, though her lowered face was twisted in agony as he opened it in front of her. He pulled out one of the 2 silver that the baker had tossed in. Moving aside and shoving the now loosely tied pouch back into her hands, he commanded,
Go on.
Eirina gripped the purse at its mouth. rushing east towards the Steel District. The clattering and clang of iron met with the hiss of steam, making the world beyond this district like a forgotten whisper. The smell of burn and the dusting of soot caked the air with a choking miasma. Eirina suffered its weight as she weaved over narrow side streets to a hole-in-the-wall apothecary. Bells chimed as she entered the shop. It was a dimly lit store, thanks to the windows being drenched with the ever-present soot from the smithies outside, letting in only streaks of brown light. The wood had trails of dark, dusted footprints from customers frequenting and dragging the outside coal indoors. The establishment was a bit on the shorter side, with shoulder-high shelves and a counter that hit most humans below the waist. However, this was to accommodate its owner, a tiny willow-haired gnome with smile lines and deep crow's feet. He had his fists on his hips as he stood atop the counter and stared up at two tradesmen.
The order is ready. You just...
He interrupted himself, stalling to silence as he looked past the men and saw Eirina enter.
Oh, Eirina!
The gnome gave her a beaming smile.
I wasn't expecting you until high sun.
Eirina seemed to want to smile, but saw the men in front of Neef glancing back at her, hard eyes narrowing in on her face. She tensed, and with a panicked pitch, said,
"Oh, there's a fever? I was hoping to get something to help."
She held her purse tighter.
"And perhaps have my usual order of root?"
The gnome put his chin in his hand, nodding and looking to his other customers. They seemed offended that the potion maker would help this ratty girl rather than them.
Can you retrieve the box for Dracus Seed Elith? These gentlemen's orders should be there. I will get started on a fever reducer.
The young woman nodded emphatically, moving behind the counter and passing between several shelves of herbs and powders. She reached an archway to the rear of the shop. Piles of boxes lined the walls of this room, each labeled with a year and date that the order was to be distributed. Tiny emblems were painted on the boxes, each depicting a different type of creature, from wyverns to rabbits. These markers made it easier to find the corresponding dates. Eirina's eyes landed on a dragon emblem, the mark of Dracus. Tracing a hand over a list at the top of the box, she found Seed Ilith listed second down from the top. Pulling the box she was looking for, she quickly hefted it over her shoulder, readying to turn for the main room, but felt a breeze reach her ankles. She walked further into the storage room and saw the back door was cracked open. She looked around, checking for any rodents or unexpected guests, but saw no one. Peeking out the door, she only heard the hammering and hollering of smiths and guardsmen. Putting the box down for a moment, she tried to pull the latch down, but found that it kept slipping free. Closing the door as best she could, she took up the box, shaking her head with a bit of a scowl before heading back to the main room. She placed the order on the counter, looking up at the men with nervousness.
Thank you, Eirina. Please feel free to give them their order. They already know the retail price.
Eirina nodded as she took out 4 bottles of iridescent liquids and 2 large pouches of what felt like powder. Each of the men laid their payment on the counter, and Eirina swept it away towards Neef. Once they had cleared out, Eirina sighed, turning towards the old gnome.
"Neef, you need to be more careful."
Neef looked up from his work with a mortar and pestle, his large spectacled eyes blinking at her.
"The rear door was open."
Darn that lock. Won't stay latched no matter what I do.
He shook his head.
You would think with as many smiths I treat for stone knuckle that one would feel grateful enough to fix the damn thing.
"Perhaps you'll have to nail it shut for now. The orders could spoil with the cold wind we've been getting."
Or the wind could bring strangers.
A figure strode out, looking over a bottle of clear liquid they had snatched from somewhere. It was a man masked with an ebony dog skull with pointed ears. His eyes were a piercing gray, and he wore dark leather and a mix of navy and brown clothes. Eirina took a step toward a shelf, readying to grab anything to defend Neef and herself, but the man tossed the bottle at her. It shattered against the shelf beside her, sending her jumping back. She put an arm out in front of the old gnome, even as her eyes were filled with fear. The man pulled a dagger from his back, moving it in a staccato pattern from side to side.
Let us all just have a civil conversation.
Eirina's face settled into anger as she continued to keep herself between the man and Neef. However, she felt a small hand push her arm aside. Neef strode over the counter, and much to his credit stood to his full, tiny height, and looked tired as he faced the masked man.
This is a humble shop. You won't find much.
Well, that's just it. I don't need much. Just whatever coin you have.
Eirina felt the man's pale eyes trace over her.
And you as well, miss. Whatever coin you're carrying, place it on the counter.
You'd rob an old man and a pauper?
This is not a business where you get to be picky.
Neef heaved a sigh and looked toward Eirina, his weathered face slack with irritation and weariness.
Give him this week's earnings. Under the counter.
Eirina gave Neef a look of pleading, but the gnome just gestured for her to move. Her brows furrowed, and she started to drop to a knee in order to reach under the counter. The thief swiftly approached, his blade catching Neef's bulbous nose, forcing the old man to look at him. Eirina stiffened, arresting her motion as her eyes flicked to the blade before meeting with the masked man.
Slowly, else your friend will be missing a nose.
A light sweat glittered on Eirina's skin as she reached down. Never taking her eyes off the thief, she groped around until she touched a large bag of coins. Taking it firmly in hand, Eirina felt as much as heard its meager weight as she picked it up, placing it to the counter. The man's gray eyes moved in the most minuscule of ways to glance at the bag. Eirina got to her feet slowly and gripped the edge of the counter with nervousness. The masked thief jutted his head in her direction.
Now you...
She has nothing but a few coppers. Just take my... Oh.
The dagger dug into Neef's nose, and the old gnome went quiet. The masked man looked at Eirina. There was a slight lift in his eyes, revealing that he was smiling behind the mask. Whether it was genuine or not, Eirina could not tell.
Come now, he's merely a flick of the wrist from losing the tip of his nose.
Eirina gripped the coin purse at her hip. There was a moment of hesitation as her eyes focused somewhere beyond the shop itself. Sorrow built on her expression, and she growled out in frustration before tearing the bag free from her side. Her hands shook as she slammed it down next to the larger pouch. The thief pulled his dagger from Neef's nose, deftly sliding his hand over the necks of the coin pouches. Neef's blood dripped onto the counter as the masked man chuffed a laugh. Eirina's body trembled, her face showing a war of emotion. When the thief moved for the rear of the shop, Eirina took several steps with desperation on her face, but quickly found the dagger hefted in her direction. The sharp gray eyes of the thief trailed from her brown hair to her hole-ridden shoes.
You'd be prettier if you took a bath.
A jovial prod in his voice as he spoke again.
Maybe then they'd pay you more at the pearl.
Eirina's face flushed with stunned anger as the man slinked away through the back of the apothecary. She went to follow after the initial sting of his words had passed, but he had cleared through. She looked outside the broken door and found no traces of him, likely having run into the smog and soot streets of the district to disappear. Eirina shoved a pile of boxes in front of the door, blockading it before she rushed back to Neef. He was dabbing his nose with a moth-hole handkerchief, his thick brows angled up as his eyes shifted toward her.
Is he gone?
Eirina nodded solemnly.
Don't look so upset.
How am I to pay for the fever reducer or the roots? That was all I had.
Eirina looked near ready to cry, but clenched her hands into fists, trembling. Neef let out a sigh, releasing his no longer bleeding nose. He scooped the fever mixture from the mortar into a paper pouch, holding it out to Eirina. She looked at Neef, not taking the pouch. He heaved another long sigh as he moved to the end of the counter, placing the pouch down before jumping off. His knees gave an audible crack, and he gave a whispered curse as he straightened. Eirina went to help, but he just waved a hand to deter her. He made his way toward a low shelf, pulling a large sack free.
Here's the full order of root.
I can't just take them, Neef.
Come now, Eirina. If I don't do this for you, it would be a desperate race to find more money, right? And we both know what could happen if Paul doesn't get this medicine.
Eirina knelt in front of the gnome, squeezing him into a tight hug.
You're too good to us.
Well, someone has to keep your best interest in mind. At the very least, I can keep an eye on you.
Neef backed away, straightening his tunic, and pushed back a few of his wispy hairs.
You gave up every coin for those kids. The Duke didn't even bother to have the orphanage rebuilt after it burned.
He took Eirina's hand and placed the mouth of the sack into her palm.
Guard that golden heart, Eirina. These are dark times, and monstrous people lurk in every corner.
I know. All too well.
Giving a weak nod, Eirina looked at the old gnome with concern.
He took your week's earnings. And you're giving this to me? Are you going to be okay?
Neef blew out his cheeks, then grinned wickedly as he stepped onto a floorboard at his feet. Eirina looked down and saw the board shift up, showing the rusted edges of an iron lockbox. He let the floorboard rest, waggling a brow at her.
I'm a clever old gnome. I'll manage.
She gave a slight shake of her head as she smiled with relief. Hefting the sack as she got to her feet, she took up the paper pouch from the counter. Neef gave her a firm nod, his large eyes almost closing as he smiled.
Now hurry off. Paul needs you.
She bent low, kissing the old gnome on his balding head before rushing out of the shop, the sound of bells dying behind her as the door slammed shut in her rush.